Greetings, chemistry students. Today I'm going to actually go through the beginnings of our PowerPoint on Vesper theory and structural formulas. We've kind of already started this with the drawing of Lewis structures and the resonance structures I showed you yesterday. I just want to kind of run through some of the highlights of the PowerPoint real quick. So, structural formulas or Lewis structures are what you have been drawing. These are the steps on how to draw them. You can access this PowerPoint on Google Classroom and peruse it at your convenience. One thing I do want to point out is that as far as multiple bonds go, triple bonds are stronger and shorter than double bonds, which are stronger and shorter than single bonds. So, for instance, when we consider the nitrogen molecule N2, which is nitrogen triple bonded to another nitrogen compared to the O2 molecule, which has a double bond, or for instance, the fluorine F2 molecule, where it's just a single bond. The triple bonds are the strongest, the single bonds are the weakest. Triple bonds are also shorter, single bonds are longer. This triple bond is also why we require what's called nitrogen fixing bacteria in order to put nitrogen into a usable form for plants to use and then for us to consume those plants or animals that ate plants so that we can use that nitrogen because it is a key component of our DNA. But our body is not capable of separating the nitrogen molecules in the air for our bodies to use. We have to actually get it as a food source. Some of this was alleviated by a German scientist named Fritz Haber, who developed a way to chemically separate the nitrogen to make nitrogen-based fertilizers. We'll talk more about him another day. But in addition to triple bonds being shorter and stronger, it's also what gives us the evidence necessary for doing things such as resonance structures. For instance, in the SO3 molecule, when you start drawing that and you realize that you have to draw the three different resonance structures, and you have the double bond over there. The reason we have to draw these resonance structures is because it gives us a better picture of reality. We've reached a limitation of the Lewis model of covalent bonds. Because when we measure the bond lengths in sulfur trioxide, we don't find that one bond is longer than the other. We don't find, or that two bonds are longer and one bond is shorter, like we would if it was two single bonds and a double bond. What we find is that all three of these bonds are the exact same length, and they're in between the lengths of a traditional single bond and a double bond, which is what implies that what we actually have is more like this is about 1 1/3 bonds at each location. So this double bond, it's kind of evenly distributed across all those places. It's not that it's moving from one place to another. It's kind of like all three of these pictures together give us an idea of reality. So that's why we have to draw resonance structures, which is what we draw when the only difference is where a double bond is located. So now for the new stuff today, Vesper theory. Yes, VSEPR is pronounced Vesper. It's an acronym for valence shell electron pair repulsion theory. And what that says is that in covalent compounds, electron pairs repel each other, and this gives us the geometric structure of the molecule. In other words, it gives us the molecule's shape. So, for instance, in the SO3 molecule, when we're talking about sulfur, the atom in the middle, these electron pairs repel each other, and they're going to want to get as far away from each other as they possibly can. And that's going to give this molecule a unique shape. Now, I've got this little chart, and using this chart, if you focus on the central atom, you can figure out what the shape of the molecule is. based on how many atoms you have bonded to it, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and how many unbonded or lone pairs of electrons you have. You can then find the shape over here. So for instance, with the SO3 molecule, it has 3 things attached to the atom in the middle, and there are no unbonded pairs of electrons on the sulfur. So that would mean that it would be trigonal planar in shape. There's a key distinction between SO3 sulfur trioxide and SO3 with a -2 charge, sulfite, because sulfite, if you'll remember, has an extra pair of electrons on the central atom. And so that means that sulfite is trigonal pyramidal in shape. So SO3 versus SO3 with a -2 charge have different shapes associated with them. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do is use a simulation. There's a simulation on what's called the PhET website. I'm going to link this simulation. It's called the molecule shape simulation. I'm going to link it in Google Classroom. I want you to go to it, click on model, and this will let you build models of the atom. So for instance, you can start with just a single atom, and we can see the molecule geometry, the shape of the molecule, as we build it. So if we just attach one thing to the atom in the middle, that's linear, which is what this is trying to show us. One atom bonded to the central atom, it's linear. It doesn't matter how many lone pairs of electrons are on that atom in the middle. Well, we say the middle, but there's only 2 things. It's linear. If we have 2 things attached to the atom in the middle, it's also linear. For instance, the carbon dioxide molecule, which looks like this, it's linear. So hopefully you can kind of visualize this. If we have 3 atoms attached to the atom in the middle, we'll talk about adding lone pairs of electrons in a bit. Like for instance, the SO3, sulfur trioxide, that is what's called trigonal planar. We can also look at these bond angles. They're 120 degrees apart. So that's the shape of these molecules. Right. If we look at something with 4 things attached to the atom in the middle, 1, 2, 3, 4 things attached, this shape is called tetrahedral. It makes the outline of a tetrahedron, which is a 4-sided object made of equilateral triangles, if you want the definition of tetrahedron. But all of these bond angles are 109.5 degrees. Now, you can make shapes where you add more than 4 things to the central atom, but that violates the octet rule. And we're not going to talk about octet rule violators in this class. So just ignore the fact that that's a thing. What we are going to consider is the effect of adding lone pairs. So if instead of having 4 things attached to the atom in the middle, we had 3 things attached plus a lone pair of electrons, for instance, in sulfite down here, SO3 with a -2 charge, that lone pair of electrons, that makes this shape what's called trigonal pyramidal. If we kind of look at it this way, it makes a pyramid shape. It's a triangle-based pyramid. If we hide the lone pair from our view, you can kind of see the triangle shape better. But essentially, what adding that lone pair does is it takes something that's a flat triangle and it pushes it down into a pyramid. And then if we had 2 lone pairs of electrons on here, then the shape is what we call bent. And a key example of this is the H2O molecule, which previously we've been kind of drawing like this. Well, that molecule is not linear. It's not a straight line with the hydrogens directly opposite each other. Although the way we drew it is kind of like if you were looking at the molecule from this perspective. where you have the hydrogens on either side and the lone pair of electrons above and below. But if we kind of rotate this around, you can see the actual shape of the molecule. We kind of hide the lone pairs. It's bent. So that's why typically when people draw a water molecule, they'll actually draw it like this to show that it's bent. Although in reality, this bond angle is not 90 degrees, it's 109.5 degrees. Or in water, it's actually slightly less than that, but we don't need to worry about that part. The only other shape to consider is if we go back to if we go back to the trigonal planar shape, if we replace one of these atoms with a lone pair of electrons, then the shape is also bent, but in this case, our bond angle is 120 degrees.